York County Community Action in Maine.
Hi, I am Sue Criven. I am the data programming and evaluation data analyst at Action for a Better Community in Rochester, New York.
Awesome. So thank you. I cannot wait to get into this conversation. Before we do, we'd like to ground ourselves in the promise of community action. So please join me and your fellow poverty fighting peers from around the country in reciting the promise of community action. So community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. So thank you. Let us carry that with us as we move forward. So before we dive in, let me just be sure that tech is working. Everybody can see my slides? Thumbs up, can you see the slides? All right. We also want to just kind of ground ourselves in what we're going to talk about today, kind of give you a lay of the land. We're going to be a little tight on time, but we do want you to put questions or comments in the chat. We'll try to address those as we go, and if we can't address them, we will take those questions back, and the data ambassadors who you're going to be introduced to in a minute will provide some additional feedback, and we'll do that in our follow-up to all of you. But we're going to start with kind of a big picture review of kind of what is this billion-dollar question, why are we having this conversation? And then the bulk of our time is going to be talking to the experts on this webinar, that is Megan and Sue. And we'll talk about that big question of, you know, how are we talking about the impact of our billion-dollar investment. And then towards the end of this webinar, we want to give you all some concrete action steps and next steps that you can take to advance this in your own communities, how you can begin to answer that question for your stakeholders. And we'll leave you with some resources to help you as you embark on those next steps. So that's the plan. With that, let's dive into this big picture. So kind of taking a step back, reminding everybody that Congress allocated $1 billion, that's billion with a B, in CARES funding to our network, to the Community Action Network. And that is in addition to the $760 million of regular CSBG funding that we received over the year. That $1 billion had a specific purpose to prevent, prepare, and respond to COVID-19 and its impacts. And this was a big deal. This kind of supplemental is really a show of support for our network and a vote of confidence in our network to be able to respond to the needs of low-income people and families and communities. And so we now have to be prepared to tell the story of what that $1 billion has done. So Congress and taxpayers, your community members, your neighbors, your friends, your peers want to know what we've done with that $1 billion, and we have to be ready to talk about that impact. So we know that we always have to be on top of our storytelling as community action agencies, but it's even more important right now. We have to be telling our story now to our stakeholders. And in order for us to effectively do that, we have to ensure that we are gathering the information we need to be able to tell that compelling story and tell the story of that impact. I think about Elizabeth Shore, who says, no data without stories and no stories without data. It's really that important. And you know, one of the caveats I want to put out here as we're kind of embarking on this conversation is people sometimes think of the annual report as the way that we tell our story. And you know, the annual report is one of the ways that we can tell the story. But I want to point out that the annual report typically, you know, it lags behind when activities actually happen. So, you know, services that you're providing right now on August 12th of 2021, those may not be reported out to Congress until next year. So we have to be telling the story now about what's happening. We cannot just rely on that annual report data to get to Congress. Another kind of nuance and caveat to consider is that our CARES CSBG annual report has a pretty narrow focus. It's focused specifically on CSBG CARES dollars and their impact. And we know that the impact of community action during COVID was so much broader than just CSBG CARES. So we have to be prepared to tell both sides of that story. And so there's lots of nuance to this. And that's why we're so excited to have the data ambassadors here with us to help us navigate this space. So with that, Ashley, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about the data ambassadors and their role.
This is my favorite part right here. So the National Partnerships CARES project has a few cohorts. We have a state association think tank, a customer cohort, and a peer experts cohort. And we also have this cohort called data ambassadors. And what we did is we sought out some community action agency data professionals that we thought were high flyers, those experts that really transformed their agency and their data excellence. And we decided, hey, I think we need to learn from these folks. We need to gather some insight into what's going on in the network and why it's important to have just some fantastic data that comes out of agencies. So we have members from Utah. We have York County Community Action Corporation in Maine. There's Megan is here with us today. We have from New York, we have Sue Curvin, and we have Amanda, who is from Texas. And then we have Nadeem, who's from Wayne Metro in Detroit. So we have a nice wide range of individuals, those data experts, data professionals that we meet monthly and talk through some of the challenges and some of the ways that we can truly become data-driven, a data-driven network, I'll put it that way. So Megan and Sue are two of the five, and we are so excited to have them here today. So we will also be having our data ambassadors going to the annual convention. They're going to be virtual attendees, and we'll have a great session that we'll share information about that later on in this webinar. So Mary Beth, I will turn it back to you.
All right, so the main event. So this is where we want to have the discussion with our experts, Megan and Sue. So we've prepared a couple of questions for Megan and Sue. Guys, on the webinar, we encourage you to put questions, comments in the chat. We'll try to address those as we go. But how about if we just jump right in? So my first question is, specifically, Megan, I'll ask you to kick us off if you don't mind. How do we tell our overall COVID-19 pandemic story while also telling our CARES Act funding story?
Yeah. So thanks, Mary Beth. That's a really awesome question, because I'm sure a lot of people who are attending today are struggling with that, where you are probably thinking to yourself, we did so much work during COVID, but not all of this was funded by CARES Act, right? And so it's really important that we are telling the overall story, but then being able to pull out the CARES Act components. So a few things. At this point, it's always so interesting because we are far along into the process, but at York County, where I am, one of the first things that I did was just this immediate recognition that we're going to want to know who we're serving that's been impacted by COVID. And so one of the very first things that I did was in our own tracking system, our own database, I immediately basically put in an opportunity to tag anyone we were working with, period, that was COVID impacted. And of course, the funny thing is that at that time, this was early on, we had no idea that this was going to last forever and that really everyone was going to be impacted. But at the time, I knew that there was going to be some way that we wanted to track like the people coming through our doors because of the fact that they had something going on related to COVID. And so that was one of the very first things I did, so that in fact, when the CARES Act funding even came about, it was wonderful because when we were building out our plan and building out, looking at needs and also thinking about how we wanted to use the funding, we were able to even look at some of the work we were already doing with those individuals to help sort of make sure we were addressing the needs that were coming through the door. So telling the overall story, a few things, thinking about if you have been tracking overall people affected, CARES Act affected people, even things like looking at your increased staff capacity. Have you increased the number of people working at your agency? Looking at the numbers sort of pre-COVID compared to during COVID, comparing the number of services you provided pre-COVID to during COVID can also be a really beneficial thing. One of the things that I'm fortunate that I work in the state of Maine, one of the things that we did as a state, and I know I have some colleagues on here who are from Maine with me, was we actually had our state association start collecting numbers and information about all of the services we were providing during COVID across our entire state and compiling that information regardless of funding. And that was wonderful because we put some graphics on it. We were able to put that out to show people sort of this is the impact of community action in the state of Maine. And it wasn't specifically CARES Act, it was just in general, like these are the number of people that we're helping get housed, that we paid rent for, that received food boxes or whatever the situation was. And so each of in the state of Maine, the 10 community action agencies collectively shared, this is what we've done during COVID, and we were able to share that information. So Sue, do you want to add to this conversation?
So I don't have a whole lot to add to what Megan has, because she really had some really great points, just that we have done our best to make some intentional connections between the work that we already do anyway, and that some of this CARES Act funding is an extension of the work that we're already doing. So kind of letting the community know that this is all the great stuff that we're already doing and is already necessary. Now there's a greater need, so we're extending it into using CARES Act funding, providing additional programming as well, but to connect the whole story, that it's not something new that we're doing, but it's a continuation, extension of what we're doing.
Those are awesome points. And picking up on something, Megan, you said you started to talk about how you started tracking the individuals served due to COVID needs right at the beginning, right? And that helped you, that you had some capacity then to be able to pull out some of that CARES Act specific work. So that's a really nice segue into our next question, which Sue, I'll ask you to kick us off is, so how is your agency tracking your CARES Act work, specifically in your CSTG CARES Act work? And do you have like tips or tricks for your peers?
So we use an agency-wide database, especially specifically for all our CARES Act funding. And we have a lot of programs, as I'm sure everybody does, they are required by funding to use their own databases. But CARES Act was my opportunity to have all of the programs that may use their other databases otherwise to say, you guys are going to have to jump on board, and we're using our agency database to track every single CARES Act funded piece of programming. So that was my first step, and it's a really an awesome way for me to kind of gently nudge everybody in that direction of an agency-wide database. So when I set up the programs in the database, because I'm the administrator, I would set up a specific CARES Act program with specific attached to specific funding. And if someone's in that program, entered in that program, they're entered in the database and the services are attached. So via the database, it's all trackable. And we created separate work plans for every single CARES Act program. And of course, they're in the CARES Act work plan that was submitted to New York State. And the difficulties that we had in tracking were when we had two specific programs that were split. We had extended. So we had our Bridges to Success program has 100 participants in it. And we decided to use some of the funding from the CARES Act to pay for part of that program. So the best way that we did to track that, because it's the same services. So we split it into half of the participants are in the regular Bridges to Success program, and the other half are in a CARES Act funded program, and they have specific case managers. They're entered in the database differently now. So it's, it was kind of a challenge to think about how are we going to do this, because it is essentially the same program. And so that was the way that we did that. And there are, I'm sure there are other options. And Megan, do you have additional comments for that?
I just would say we did similar things too, where we sort of braided some funding sources around programs. And so we did similar to you, we had to tag, these are the CARES Act funded clients in this particular program versus non-CARES Act funded. And so like you, we had a set database for us to be able to indicate that. But it is something you have to be thoughtful about so that you can prove that you're not double dipping, right? That's a very important thing when it comes to this money. And so that type of tracking is really, really important. Another consideration around this, and again, I know many of you at this point already have plans, but I know that some states are at different places and you can obviously edit plans and whatnot. But we also, just as we were thinking about using the CARES Act money and tracking, we did actually take time to think about those areas that, I hate to say it, but also would meet a need, but also were easier to track, to be honest. And so what happened was we shifted some of our resources around, saying, okay, well, it makes more sense to move this resource over here and CARES Act here, because for tracking purposes, it's just going to be easier for us to do it this way. And so it's something to think about around like just your capacity with your technology and the way that you're already tracking things. Keep that in mind, like what actually might be a way to address a need, but is you already have like systems in place, or that you already have capacity for that type of tracking, and really consider that, so you're not it's already stressful during a pandemic, so try to use your existing resources is what I'm trying to say.
That's a really good point. And we have a question that just came in. Megan or Sue, maybe you could give a specific example of where either you moved resources, or maybe you had more capacity in one program to do that kind of reporting, but maybe, and so maybe you chose to put that into your CARES funding. Do you have an example like that?
So in terms, I want to make sure I'm understanding. So it's in terms of where we chose to move funding and put CARES Act where it was going to be easier. I just want to make sure that that's what the person's asking for an example of. And if that's the question, then the example would be, we were doing a bunch of work with our health center, and it might seem like, oh, well, that might be a really appropriate place for us to use our CARES Act money, is to like do all this work around our health center and addressing, vaccination or whatever might be the case. But we realized quickly that with the particular funding with our health center and just the systems at our health center, it was going to be a heavier lift for us just to do that type of tracking and whatnot. And so it actually was just going to be a lot easier for us to actually shift some of our CSBG money that was not CARES Act towards some of our work addressing the health center, and our CARES Act, we moved more towards our case management, where we already had like a system to track. So that would be an example of a specific situation where we made that choice.
That's a great example. And, the thing that I think of is there's probably not one right answer, but there's a right answer for your agency. So, having those intentional conversations, Sue and Megan, you both talked about this, being very intentional about this and making those decisions. Also on the front end, right? Kind of plotting it out before you're running through the stress of the pandemic. So let's move on to another question. And I think this one, Megan, I'll ask you to lead us off. Kind of in the similar space, how are you choosing where to put your CSBG funding, or your CSBG CARES funding, excuse me. And how are you telling the story of why you are investing in those specific needs or areas?
Yeah, so So like I said, some of the choice was by looking at some of our existing systems, like I already referenced. I already sort of said we wanted to build upon areas that we already had expertise in and skills in. And like I said, we were also tracking people right from the get-go, so we could sort of see where the needs were. Some of the CARES Act funding that in our plan, some of the needs sort of fell in our lap, to be honest with you. I think, which is likely the case during a pandemic. So for example, so many people were applying for unemployment, right? And we immediately knew that we needed to help with that process because there just was like this massive backlog of people applying for unemployment. So that one sort of just fell into our laps in a way. Like we just needed to address this because it was just coming towards us. Another thing is our state actually decided to work with us around contact tracing. And so anyone who needed to quarantine or what have you due to COVID, if they needed help getting groceries or finding housing or any of these other social needs, they would be referred to us. And so we also put in some additional supports around that contact tracing work. And again, that was something that came through the state that was just, it kind of came our way, right? It was just respond in the moment. And so we were able to react to that and use our CARES Act money to support some of those efforts. But like I said, we also then built upon existing things that we had, such as, housing navigation and case management, those types of things we were already doing and already had a growing need for. And so we were able to just, like I said, tag the CARES Act funded people as they were coming in for those types of services. So Sue, anything you want to add?
Sure. So we approached it a little bit differently for a couple of reasons. We actually didn't receive funding in the immediate beginning of the pandemic, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But when we looked at our needs assessment, there were a whole lot of agencies in the Rochester area that were providing those emergency services that we immediately thought were going to need to be provided, such as food insecurity issues and employment and housing support and everything. But there was so much other help out there in the community that we were looking at what are some of the other gaps. And one of the things that one of our programs came up with is just absolutely beautiful, which is they purchased and distributed Chromebooks to people so that they could work from home and do schooling from home. So it was addressing that immediate gap of all of a sudden, especially everything is going to online school from home, remote learning, but people don't have the technology. You have a phone, you can't really, participate in online learning on a phone. It's just very difficult. So we purchased and distributed 400 Chromebooks, I believe. And again, we didn't receive the funding right away, but we had a partnership with an agency, a credit union here in Rochester to do the same thing. So we started distributing using the funding from that grant, and then we continued the distribution with the CARES Act funding. And we have like a budget of how many per month moving forward. So they're not all handed out yet. So I think that was a really amazing piece of filling in the gap that wasn't necessary. Nobody else was filling that need. We also had a smaller one. This is a partnership as well to one of the local cable companies. We partnered with them to provide internet access for a few customers. It wasn't a large number, but it's a start. And looking forward, this is something that as we someday move post-pandemic, how can we continue that sort of service? Because the digital divide in Rochester, I'm sure everywhere, the digital divide is huge, and it's a real barrier to a whole, especially in this pandemic. It arose as like one of the biggest barriers to people being successful with learning and with working from home.
So Sue, kind of a similar question, but in the reverse. Were there places that maybe your community thought you should have been putting funding, but you didn't? And if so, why? And how are you explaining that?
So not so much outside from somebody in the community saying that we should do this, but there were places when we first started this pandemic, we thought we were going to be needing to do all of this different programming, especially regarding emergency needs. And like I said, there were so many other agencies filling in those gaps that we didn't actually end up needing to provide like utility payments. We had that on an emergency needs work plan, and we had money allocated to provide emergency rental payments, which I'll talk about in a second, utility payments, food baskets, and so on. But there were, again, so many others that actually ended up not being a need. And a lot of those dollars right now are unspent. So we're shifting gears now, saying, okay, well, we didn't actually need that. So there was a large uptick in housing needs. So there has been, rental assistance payments and so on. So we're kind of shifting some of those funds away from, we didn't need utility payments. The heat program stepped up. So we're shifting that back over into the housing payments, especially with the ending, the anticipated end of the eviction moratoriums. So the other piece of the program that we shifted away from the emergency needs is to, and I think this is a really cool program. One of our programs that was created is the pandemic affected response team, is what it's called. And it is a case management based program to help people return to their pre-COVID levels or better. So many people lost jobs. They ended up in situations where they're needing help. They never needed it before. And now all of a sudden they're in a situation where, I have no job. I have no way to pay my rent. I have no way to feed my kids. And now they're needing assistance. And so we have this case management team set up on their intake. They have to show that they lost it. They're in the situation they're in because of a COVID related issue, such as job loss. And then there's case management steps they go through. We're using the matrix to track it. So they come in and they do this initial matrix, and we're going to track over time. And then there's case management steps that they're going to work on to help people get back to where they were prior to COVID or better, and hopefully better.
Yeah, and similar to Sue, I don't really have much to add other than, likewise, we thought we were going to have to do a lot more of those emergency things. Children were now not going physically to school. So were we going to have to think about meals for kids, that type of thing. And then the community just stepped up in so many ways that was not something we had to do anymore. And so, yeah, we just had to shift gears as well into other areas, knowing that our community, we haven't had anyone ask us about why we haven't spent money in those areas at this point. But certainly, I think if we get those questions, the wonderful thing is we can speak to how much our other community partners and community members were able to step up to the plate as well in those situations.
Yeah, partnerships are such a big piece of this, right? That's what enables you to make good use of your resources. And the other thing I think that I know from both of you is you have data to support your decisions, right? Data is not always just, customer data, but it's community data, right? Y'all know your communities well and deeply, and you have really good relationships with your partners who also provide you data to kind of help you figure out where's the best use of your resources and how you all can work together well. So kind of, continuing that theme then, how do you share information broadly to the community? How do you share the story of your agency during this time? And what practices work for you to do that? So, Sue, I think you kick us off on this one.
So we actually are lucky. We have a communications department, and I'm in the program planning and evaluation, and we work with the communications department, and we get together and discuss, these are the things, and we're trying to collect data from the programs to say, okay, tell us, we have all these numbers. Numbers are fantastic. Numbers are important, but we also want to have some individual stories. So let's collect some of those stories, and let's figure out ways to put them out into the community, so that not just people not just within the programs know, because sometimes within our agency, other programs don't even know what the programs are doing. So we have social media, things are posted out on social media. We have relationships with the press, and we send out press releases, and we also have we're involved with several community level initiatives, and we're making sure that we're putting out there the things that APC has been doing. And one of the notes that we have is that understanding that it goes beyond the APR, and it's massively, immensely beyond the APR. The APR is a reporting tool that's so tiny compared to the story that we need to tell. So my recommendation is that have anybody who's responsible for some sort of reporting out into the community, talk with your programs, go and talk to your programs, and again, in the word intentional, go and find out what's the best thing that you feel you've done coming out of COVID, and then capture that somewhere, and again, we have a communications department, luckily, that can do this, but you don't have to. You can have some sort of a document repository and write up some things. Can we do some short videos and put them out there? And there are, quite honestly, other agencies that are doing it better than we are. So I go and I look at what everybody else is doing. What have they put out? And in Syracuse, there's the Peace Incorporated in Syracuse has done some amazing COVID related documents like that they put out to the public. So, the data is extremely important, and to just backtrack just a slight bit, making sure that all of our programs, all of our staff understand that collecting all this data is tremendously important. This is why we need to do it, but it only tells a small piece of the story. So let's jump beyond that and start collecting actual, qualitative data and stories.
And just to build on what Sue was saying, honestly, after we kind of wrapped our heads around things a little bit, we really revamped our website to include COVID resources right at the top of our page. And we put it right next to a Need Help Now button that people could access. And we've just provided tons of information, social media posts like pretty much every day. We also have an internal bulletin board where we were sharing information about what was going on in the agency. I mean, things were changing and moving so quickly, like Sue was saying. Sometimes it was hard for our own team to even be aware of. We were hiring new people like every day, and this new thing was happening. I mean, it's chaos, right? And so we used our internal bulletin board a lot. We also had internal emails that we were sending people, as well as we have, and we've continued to do so. We're sending like bi-weekly, even public emails going out about stuff, because just during this time, there's just so much going on that we have significantly increased our touches to our community members because of everything.
Yeah, and a thread that I think is being that is between your two stories is this idea of capacity building, or that you had to have capacity to be able to do some of those things, right? So how are you using your CSBG CARES fund specifically for capacity building, to tell your story, to document the data, to do the data, to tell the story, and how are you doing that? And maybe Megan, maybe you want to kick off there.
Yeah, so I actually was looking in the chat at some of the questions about the community needs assessment and like the mission and strategic plan. And I feel like that goes really well with this question, because it sounds crazy, but in a strange way, all of this actually has advanced our strategic planning work, because we actually built so many more efficiencies around centralized data so that we could have really good information regarding our strategic planning initiatives, because we moved everything like electronically. That was huge for us. I mean, even our clients were applying online. And so just the amount of information that we now had that we were able to tie back to some of our strategic planning work and have things feel so much more streamlined was it was that in and of itself built capacity for us, right? To have all this additional robust information, and we actually built in systems to connect more directly with our clients and our families, and all of that led to more capacity. I already sort of referenced this earlier too, but we built capacity because we were able to use CARES Act funding, to address certain needs and even expand existing programs, and that actually freed up resources for us to shift to other parts of our work that we actually were trying to do around some of our strategic planning initiatives and other needs. So we have a big project around social determinants of health, and we were able to actually turn more money towards that project because we had CARES Act funding some of the other work. And so it really did help us build capacity around some of the initiatives that we had work plans for, we built logic models around, but we were just like kind of moving at snail's pace. And then all of a sudden we have this influx of resources, right? And so it really allowed us to accelerate some of those projects. I think we all were kind of surprised by that piece.
Sue, anything to add there?
Yeah, so for capacity building, a little bit, one of the things I like about when I work with Megan is because she's a high, like this higher agency level, and I'm much more programmatic level, which I think is a really nice trade-off. So on a programmatic level, one of our programs, our adult education program, was already growing immensely, and then all of a sudden they're doing remote learning, and they immediately shifted into a remote learning mode and had to develop these strategies and technologies to be able to shift to teaching classes online and remotely. So, and we're blessed with some really good technologically adept staff down there. So they did receive separate CARES Act funding, and they put in place systems like using Google Classroom and Zoom, and they started recording classes and putting them on YouTube. And it ties into that whole getting people devices so that they could participate from home. And the nice thing about this is that we're going to be able to extend that again into the future. As the pandemic goes away, there still have always traditionally been problems with people being able to access services because they're at work or they're caring for their kids at home. They're not able to come in to do services in person anyway, under normal circumstances. So putting these systems in place now is going to improve our agency capacity going forward, forever, because now people are going to be able to choose an option of either a fully in-person class or program, a fully remote program, or some sort of a hybrid program. And we are also increasing our agency capacity data-wise, where people can use, like Megan was saying, you can apply online, and there's like a learning management system built into our database now that we're going to be able to develop classes in the database itself, which will be really nice. In addition to that, something that's totally on the ground, we were, our business services office was really clever and decided, asked for and was approved funding to put in protective systems in place in the building. So we switched to automatic hand washers, and there's a temperature sensing device in the lobby so that when somebody comes in, you stand in front of this and it takes your temperature and you're cleared to go in. And additional disinfecting staff and training protocols and everything. So that's not something that you think about with CARES Act funding, but when people are coming back to the site, we need to make sure that they feel safe coming back to the site. So we now have systems in place where people are going to be more comfortable as we're able to come back fully on site. So that's another thing that, kind of isn't right up there with that whole, this is the great programming we're providing, but it's a behind the scenes thing that we also want to think in these lines as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Those systems won't go away when CARES Act funding goes away either, right? This is a long-term investment capacity. It's going to help you respond in the future. So we did receive a couple of questions in the chat. I want to see if y'all have anything to add on any of these. So there's a question about, during all of this, how much alignment, intentional or otherwise, did you see between needs being met and those identified in your last round of CNA? And I think you've both kind of spoken to this, but do you have anything to add there?
I'm just going to go back to the connect back and prove community action's mission. We use the matrix pretty extensively in a couple of our programs, and that's one of the things that I have really been pushing with, my own personal agenda. We do some analysis of that matrix, and I showed it to the data ambassador group. And if you do a matrix repeatedly over time with customers who come in, and a couple of our programs are now in the habit of they do an initial matrix and then they follow up in 3 months with another matrix. And so it's an ongoing case management tool for anybody who receives intensive case management. And you can use this to show trends over time and how that participant is, improving or not, or, decreasing on those scales over time. And I have been able to pull that together and use that to show previously and with CARES Act to funders that our programs are working because we have this demonstrated data from this matrix that we use. And somebody had asked if I could send it out, and I will send the matrix out to Mary Beth, and we'll get it out to you guys later. And it's a really cool tool, and it gives you some very specific data about each individual client. But if you use it together, you can use it as a programmatic analysis tool.
I just would say, if you're not using some type of matrix, I think it's a really great tool. We also have one that we use across programs. So it definitely helps prove that you are in fact making a difference in people's lives, right? In regard to the question around the community needs assessment, if you're referring to like the big community needs assessment versus the COVID one we had to do, I would say that, probably not surprising, I'm sure all of you are in the same boat, but housing certainly rises to the top and most in a lot of ways on community needs assessments. The interesting thing is that during COVID, we did coordinate the rent relief program. We still are in the midst of that program and will be probably for, it feels like ever, the rest of our lives. But it's a little different, right? Because in some ways it feels like it's absolutely necessary for us to pay people's rent, right? Like it is so necessary. Like that's what we have to do. But in terms of addressing the greater need around housing in our community, in some ways, we're not doing that because we're paying people's rent, right? Like we're not taking the time to go out and build the housing and do those other projects. I think we're now we're resurfacing to be able to go back to those types of things that came out of our community needs assessment. But so in a way we are addressing the need, but it's just different right now in this time where we're trying to address the immediate need in front of us, right? So I don't know if that answered that person's question, but it's what we're experiencing.
And I'm sure you guys can see folks are asking for both of your matrices, matrices, I guess is the correct plural. And we'll be sure to share those out. And there is this question in the chat about, organizations who don't have data experts on staff, and how can they get these data tools? And one of the ways is through sessions such as this, that we're able to do that. Share out some of the tools and resources from your peers. Also, always feel free to call partnership. We're happy to help you connect with tools and resources.
I just want to quickly add though, because I do think this is important, that Sue and I both are not data experts. So she and I both, so I used to be a program director, Sue comes from program world as well. And so I just share that because I think I want people to realize like you can actually do this, but I will fully acknowledge that my agency realized that I cared a lot about data within my own programs. And so they did create a position for me to help our whole agency, but you don't have to have an advanced degree in data.
Yeah, mine's a similar situation where I was doing some stuff on the programmatic level with data, and they were like, "Hey, can you do this for more people?" And I was like, "Absolutely." And I actually had said in the chat over here that is one of the purposes of this data ambassador program, and we're working on ways to get some of the things that we do and find things other people are doing and get them out to the network. And it's in its beginning stages, so we don't have like yes, here you go, here's the resources. But it's part of the plan.
So we've got a couple of rapid fire questions before we kind of round out this section of our presentation today. First, just thinking about the pandemic so far, what do you think went well at your agency? And, you know, knowing what you know now, what important lessons have you learned in all of this? So Megan, I'll ask you to kick us off.
Sure. So I already referenced it. I'm really glad that I thought to start like just tracking the people impacted by COVID right away. It saved me so much as we moved forward. Another thing that I just want to share too, that again, sort of lessons or just in retrospect, I'm so glad that I have really strong relationships with our state partners. Before we knew what reporting was going to look like or what CARES Act was going to look like, our state office actually met with me and said, how do you think we should track this stuff? Like, I still don't know what it's going to look like, but we need to figure out, we know we're going to have to track it, right? So let's talk about how we can put some systems in place in preparation. And I think just, it's great to have those conversations, but the point I'm trying to make is the relationship that you can have with your state partners is really, really valuable. So if you are lacking in that area, I do recommend building those relationships, because it really did help us tremendously as we moved through this process.
And I think I'm on the right place. So things that went well, is that what we're looking at? So what went well was our programs just jumped in and found needs in ways that they could work with what the community needed prior to even the CARES Act funding being announced. You know, that we were jumping in doing things. Our weatherization program is an amazing example. They were not able to go in and weatherize houses. And so we had the staff and the equipment, the vehicles, and they're not doing anything. They created a partnership with our local 211 line. It's a helpline, and the United Way to deliver food boxes. So FoodLink bought the food boxes. Our staff went and picked up the food boxes and delivered them. And I am in the background creating delivery routes so that they can not just like, where am I going next? But we have a whole delivery route set up that's, you know, efficient and everything. You know, some really great stuff behind the scenes. And there's a tool out there that does that. That was not me. I looked it up on Google. And then the other piece that I also mentioned was that we created our work plan in June of 2020, and we did not actually get funding until January of 2021. And by that time, some of the stuff that we had planned for, the need was no longer there. And so we had to shift gears, and we have amended, and we are going to also be amending again our work plan to adjust to the fact that there is less of a need for those emergency services now and more of a need for long-term recovery. And so that's one of the things that I think that was an amazing thing that our programs are doing.
So one last question for the both of you. Give me your top thing you would recommend, your number one that you would recommend to your peers to do at their agencies to answer this billion-dollar question of the CARES funding impact. Who you could kick us off?
And it goes back to what I said before. Go to your programs and find the individual stories. You are most likely already collecting the data that you need to support with numbers. But if we want to really go out there and show the CARES Act affected people specifically in these ways and get some really good stories that are examples of, you know, you have an increase of employment, you know, these people, you help these people get jobs, we go out and find what happens to that person that they needed the job, and what's their story and how has it affected them since they've gotten this job. Or for us, with going back to the Chromebooks, go and find out get some stories from people of how did this help make your life more tolerable during this pandemic. And some of the stories are simply, they were given to senior citizens so that they could stay in contact with their families. You know, these are the stories that we need to tell, and the numbers can't give us those stories.
And I would just add to that, make a list of everything your agency did since COVID. And even if it wasn't funded by CARES Act, like just write down everything you did, everything. And first of all, I think you will be absolutely amazed if you can like have a team that just writes down. It could be little things, like the smallest things that you did. Like, I mean, just ways that maybe you helped neighbors connect to neighbors. I mean, anything, right? So like create an entire list of all of those things and then ask yourself, okay, how many of these things were made possible due to CARES Act? And even if CARES Act didn't fund it, but because we knew CARES Act was funding was coming, or we were able to braid funding, or whatever it might have been, maybe it even came from your plan that, as Sue mentioned, you didn't even get to implement because the funding came later, but you were planning for it. And so you still did it. I mean, all of these things were possible because of this money, right? Like you wouldn't have planned those things if it wasn't for that money. And so I do recommend that you, if you haven't done that, do that as just an exercise, maybe with your team to go through that, because it is going to help you be able to just communicate and articulate the story so much more fully if you can even just have that list and combine that with the stories. How many people did you serve before COVID versus after? How many employees did you have before versus after? All of these things are going, what systems did you have after that you didn't have before? Technology. I mean, all of these things are part of this story. And if you can just sit down and put all of that stuff on paper, you're going to be much more prepared to share the story.
Well, Megan and Sue, this has been an amazing conversation, and you guys just deserve like a round of applause for your, not just, sharing your knowledge here today, but for all of your awesome work throughout the pandemic. So thank you for all of that. We're going to switch gears a little bit, guys, as we close out and just talk about a couple of next steps. So I hope that Sue and Megan got you fired up and ready to go. And now we want to help you channel that fire and that energy into some action. So the first point is take action now. Go ahead, do what Megan said. Go back and figure out what have I done in my agency. Start tallying that up. Figure out, do you have the data you need to tell the story? Think about what story is emerging and how you're telling that. And the moment is now. If you discover you're missing something, this is the time that you can still course correct, right? You can go back and get that data now. But the big point here is take action now and start telling the story now. Think about who needs to know. Is it your congressperson? Is it your state legislature? Is it your community partners? And think about how you are communicating with them specifically. And Ashley's going to give you a couple of tools to help you communicate quickly and easily, because we know everybody is busy, and hopefully these tools will make that easier for you. Also, just consider review your website. What are you sharing publicly and easily? If a reporter gets a story about funding that went to your agency, can they go to your website and find out about it, right? And see some of the impact of those dollars. So take these couple of steps now after this webinar. And also, if you need help, call us at the partnership. We're happy to help. We're happy to help you get connected with peers and the data ambassadors. We are all here to help. One of the best things about this network is the people. And we would love to help you connect with all of these amazing folks from around the country. And also encourage you to keep the conversation going. This is not a one and done. This is a part of a larger conversation that I hope will continue. Come see us at the annual convention. We have a number of presentations kind of in this vein, and Ashley will talk about those. And I just want to flag for everybody that to please complete the evaluation after this webinar is complete. There is at least one specific question kind of about what you need from us to help you tell the story. So please be sure that you complete that. So Ashley, I'll turn it over to you to bring us home with a review of our resources.
Yeah, so I'm going to run through this real quickly. You've probably all seen these in our e-news. If you have not signed up for our e-news, please go to communityactionpartnership.com and you'll see a subscribe at the top right. Please click on that and you'll be able to subscribe to the e-news. Strategic America templates, these have been out for a couple of months now. Please access them. You can make them your own, tell your own story, but all the information is there, everything that you need. You can download them and use them however you'd like. We do have a Community Action Gets Vaccinated video. It's some leaders from different communities talking about why it's important. You can go to the next slide. And of course, our logos, you probably saw those. And then we have this amazing visual. It's telling our COVID-19 response story. You can access that. You can use it however you'd like, but it is talking about the 4 R's is what we're calling them. So you can access that graphic as well. It'll also be available at the annual convention. If you would like to access it there, we'll have some for purchase. You can go to the next slide. We have a couple webinars coming up. The Nonprofit Risk Management Center, Melanie Lockwood Herman, has been working with us over the last few months. We have number 7 of 8 coming up, accessing resilience resources from public and private sources, August 19th at 2 o'clock Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Next slide. And then we have her last webinar in the series, How to Become the Resilient Leader Your Mission Requires. That is September 16th, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Go ahead, next slide. We also have leadership coaching. I mentioned peer expert cohort. This is one of their initiatives. You can reach out to Lana Shope or Lily Sills. This is an excellent way for new leaders, any leaders at your agency that are wanting to connect with a different agency that has some really great best practices for you. So there's information on that. We can go to the next slide. And of course, our annual convention's coming up. Here's a list of our sessions that are more related to data. You'll see the data ambassadors. We have a couple of them who are going to be participating in understanding data systems and processes in a new reality. That's on Thursday the 2nd. So keep an eye out for that. Please join us for any of our sessions, but these are specific for data. You can go to the next slide. And Mary Beth, I will hand it over to you to close us out.
So if you want to follow up from anything you heard, please do reach out to myself. You can also reach out to Lana Shope, who is the CARES Project Director. There's tons of resources in the chat that have been posted. Please be sure that you take that evaluation and join me in thanking our amazing panelists, Megan and Sue. Thank you both so much for your time today. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Please take care of yourselves. And we hope to see you in Boston very soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.